We are joined via Zoom by Mike Law, an independent political strategic advisor, senior researcher at the Paternoster Group. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Now, ahead of the November 1 elections, it would seem the writing was already on the wall for the three big political parties that tough times lay ahead. Post-election, it would seem that already coalition governments are proving harder to manage. When you begin to assess where we are now, do you think coalition governments are the answer for a better service delivery, Mike?
Well, good afternoon, Onati. Thank you so much for having me on your show. Certainly, coalitions are not something that we do by choice. Obviously, every political party would rather they would be allowed to do things on their own. The coalitions are just a simple fact of life. If no one gets 50%. The question of whether it will lead to better service delivery is complex. I think, generally speaking, the answer would be no. Coalitions tend to be less stable than a single party majority government. Obviously, if you have one party in power and they are able to supposedly deliver on their manifesto without having to compromise at any point, they should find their jobs a bit easier than when you have a sort of a 6, 8, 10 party coalition like we do in some of these South African metros, with parties sort of jumping from side to side and always trying to keep everyone happy. It is really, really hard to actually get down to the nitty-gritty of service delivery. So you'd hope that with more views, more parties in government, more eyes watching over each other's shoulders, that perhaps you could get some better outcomes. But unfortunately, so long as we carry on doing coalitions the way that we've seen, as some of those scenes showed in your introductory video, it's very hard to see good, stable delivery, service delivery in these situations.
And that is very unfortunate, given the fact that we've been here before. I mean, you've given your previous analysis post-2016, and you've also previously described coalition politics as one of the most delicate political art forms. So what will it take for coalitions to work?
Well, I think the essential core ingredient, if you forgive me for sounding a bit simplistic, is the political will and a genuine commitment to make the thing work. A group of political parties need to get together and say, okay, we don't necessarily agree on everything. We spent the last 2 months of this campaign calling each other terrible things, but we can agree that we want the people of the city to enjoy stable government. And while we can't agree on ABC policies, we can maybe agree on D, E, and F, and we can put that into a program and get it done and have a genuine commitment to make the thing last its 5-year term. That is a necessary but not a sufficient condition. There's lots of other aspects to coalition governance that need to be put in place. As you say, it's very complex. It takes a long time, decades, to build coalition cultures. But I think the core starting agreement is that genuine commitment to make it work.
Now, I mean, you saw in our previous story that we played, just earlier, a lot of uncertainty in some of these previously hung municipalities where there are these kind of partnership, most of them very loose, I might add. But talk to us about what we are seeing, particularly in these metros, like in Gauteng, for instance, in Johannesburg and in Tshwane, and also parts of KwaZulu-Natal. What are we likely, to expect from these? We know that, after 3 attempts, Johannesburg now seems to, starting to formalize their sort of, business as usual. But what is likely to happen in these metros?
Look, I don't see them, unfortunately, being too much different to what we saw after the 2016 local government election. Even though I think the Patriotic Alliance has now sort of joined the fold in Joburg, getting that DA-led coalition, as it's called, a majority. It's still on very rocky grounds. The Patriotic Alliance themselves have said that they're really just in it for power. So I'm sure if they could find a better deal elsewhere, they'll look at that very quickly. And of course, as we know, the DA mayors were elected in those Gauteng metros with the support of the EFF. And the EFF showed its hand last time around, and it seems to be going on a similar route where it will lend support to the DA to elect the initial mayors, but that's sort of far from guaranteed. And we see really tight numbers games in these legislatures. If you look at Nelson Mandela Bay, for example, that's essentially a 60-60 split amongst the seats, where you got a range of smaller parties with one seat that can swing it. And I think that's another thing we need to look at, is the threshold for representation in these legislatures, which is very low in South Africa. And by that I mean, how many votes do you need to get one seat, whether it's in parliament or a provincial legislature or municipal council, like in these elections? And initially in South Africa, we decided to have a low threshold for good reasons, because we wanted diversity of views and all our many races, languages, cultures, religions represented in parliament. But what it does result in is lots and lots of smaller parties. So you see in Joburg, I think, with 17 political parties. I think Ekurhuleni, another great example, I think something like 23 parties there, which 10 have one seat. And when the numbers game is so tight and all of these one-seat parties are indispensable to hold your power, the situation is almost ungovernable. So that's perhaps another thing when you look at. I think a low threshold is justified in the South African context, but I think it's a little bit extreme as it is now. And, you know, in countries with long coalition cultures, we see good coalitions. They're normally between 2 or 3 parties. Trying to do a deal and trying to keep everyone happy when there's sort of 10 involved makes it a lot more difficult.
When we start looking at international standards and also best practices across the globe, South Africa has obviously been drawn into how can we then start looking at, almost modeling some of these, what internationally is happening, and most analysts saying that political parties of opposing ideological views can work together. So it would seem that most parties are worried about possible backlash from their electorates. What's at stake here, and what are your views in terms of what can we learn and draw from what is happening on the international landscape?
Yeah, I must say I personally have been very lucky to be a part of teams that have taken delegations of senior South African political leaders to some of these countries to do one-on-one interactions and study tours with their counterparts in some of these other countries with very long coalition histories. I think the first thing to note is that it takes time. As you said, this is a complex and delicate political art form. It takes decades to build coalition cultures. And getting all the structural aspects, the government, the core governance things that you need to do in place and learn how to do it properly it takes a long time. Germany is always referred to as a classic example of where coalitions have done very well, but at the same time, they've had coalitions in place since the end of World War II. So they've had a lot of time to learn, and it's almost become ingrained in their electoral system. So there's lots to learn from abroad. Of course, the South African political context is unique, as every country is. Some lessons can be learned, and some lessons aren't really going to be translatable. But I think the thing that strikes me when you go to these countries is just how hard they're working. The amount of hours you spend before an election and just after an election day to sort of put together a program and structures in place to communicate, to make decisions, to settle your arguments internally instead of having them spill over into the legislature like we see now or into the media. So there's lots to learn, but I think it will ultimately take time. And while these coalitions are very frustrating to watch now, although I do think there is some signs of perhaps a little bit of improvement, it's still good to see a bit of practice, so to speak, because if this does come to be the norm in the provinces or even the national governments in 2024, this experience will help.
And you talk about it taking, time, and of course a lot of focus is being placed on, 2024. I was actually listening to an interview with, David Makhura in his capacity as ANC chair in Gauteng by one of my colleagues, while he conceded the dismal turnout in the November 1 elections was as a result of people actually opting to stay at home as opposing to choosing which political party, to vote for. The question then is on active citizenry. As we look at 2024, why would South Africans opt to stay at home and not vote? And also if they knew that they had the power, and they also understood and appreciated that it takes time for coalitions to actually work, what then can they start doing now to make sure that, action is needed now, and also come 2024, we start seeing that action happening for the people of South Africa?
Yeah, quite a loaded question, especially on democratic participation, which unfortunately is dropping across the world. Not consistently. Some countries are doing better, but generally we're seeing lower and lower voter turnout. And in South Africa, of course, it is even worse in local government elections, where in this case, I think voters voted with their feet. It's a question for all strategists. It's how to get people to the polls. But from a coalition sense, I think the main thing is that political parties can play their power games now, and they can try, divvy up the spoils of office. But at the end of the day, the voters are only going to care in 2024 about, did you create a stable government? Did you deliver services? And if you can't do that in your coalition arrangements that you're making now, you're best to stay in opposition, because you're just going to look very, very untrustworthy to a voter come 2024. So there's a lot of ground to be covered before we get there. The issues that are issues today won't necessarily be the issues in 2024. Some of them will, of course. But certainly the evidence that we've seen suggests that these coalitions could become part of the norm.
Mike, I'm told I can't squeeze in another question, so I'm afraid this is where we have to leave it. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Really do appreciate it. All right, Mike Law, an independent political strategic advisor, senior researcher at the Paternoster Group, talking about the future of coalitions in this country. All right.